The morning Eleanor Marsh found half her bean plants stripped to the stalks, she sat down in the dirt and cried for the first time since burying her husband. It was the spring of 1874, and the Colorado Territory was waking up green and indifferent to the grief of widows. Eleanor had been living alone at the edge of Ridgecrest, a small ranching settlement tucked against the foothills of the San Juan Mountains, for 8 months now. 8 months since Thomas Marsh had been thrown from his horse on a wet October morning, struck his head on a creek stone, and never opened his eyes again. The town had offered its sympathies, brought her casseroles and prayers, and then quietly returned to its own business, because the West was not a place that allowed grief to linger too long before practicality reasserted itself. Eleanor understood that. She was 26 years old, dark-haired, with soil-roughened hands and a stubbornness that had kept her alive through a brutal Colorado winter. She had fed herself on what she'd preserved from the previous autumn, had burned through most of the firewood Thomas had stacked beside the house, and had made careful, quiet plans for the spring. Those plans were her garden. A small, rectangular patch of earth behind the cabin, maybe 30 feet by 20, where she intended to grow beans, squash, carrots, lettuce, and the tomatoes Thomas had always loved. It was going to be her declaration of survival, her proclamation that she intended to stay. And now the deer had found it. She sat in the dirt for a long while, the cool May morning air drifting down from the mountains in waves, carrying the smell of pine and snowmelt. Then she pressed her palms against her thighs, stood up, and decided she needed a fence. The trouble was that Eleanor did not know how to build one. Thomas had done all the carpentry, all the heavy labor around their small homestead. He had been a competent, quiet man, good with his hands, and his absence left 1,000 practical gaps in her daily life that she was slowly learning to fill. She could chop kindling now. She had learned to patch the roof in one corner where water leaked. She'd caulked the window frame herself using a mixture she'd read about in a homesteading pamphlet. But a proper fence, the kind that would actually stop a deer, which could jump surprisingly well, required posts sunk deep into the ground and rails and wire, and she did not have the tools or the raw materials, and she was not sure she had the strength for the post setting alone. She walked around the edge of her ruined garden, assessing the damage with a practical eye. The deer had come from the tree line, which was only about 40 yards behind the cabin. They had likely been watching all spring, patient as shadows, waiting for something worth eating. The beans were a loss. The lettuce was entirely gone. The squash seedlings mercifully had been ignored, perhaps not yet fragrant enough to tempt them, and the carrots, still barely visible above the soil, seemed untouched. There was still time to save the garden, but not if she waited. She went inside, washed her face, pinned her dark hair back under her bonnet, and went to speak to her nearest neighbor, a widow herself named Henrietta Gable, who lived about 3/4 of a mile down the road and always seemed to know everything and everyone in Ridgecrest. Henrietta was in her 60s, sharp-eyed and brisk, with a porch perpetually crowded with drying herbs and a garden so well established it could have withstood a cavalry charge. "You need Caleb Rourke," Henrietta said without hesitation, before Eleanor had finished explaining her situation. She was standing at her kitchen counter, grinding coffee beans, and she did not stop grinding when she spoke. "He built my chicken coop 3 years ago, and it has not lost a single bird since. He fences, he frames, he splits timber, and he is fair with his price." "Where does he live?" Eleanor asked. Henrietta pointed vaguely up the mountain. "Up the ridge, about 2 miles north. He has a cabin past the Second Creek crossing. He comes into town every week or so for supplies. You could wait for him to come in, or you could go up." Eleanor did not feel like waiting. She thanked Henrietta, accepted a cup of the fresh coffee, and went home to saddle her mare. The ride up the mountain took her through country she had rarely ventured into in the 8 months she'd lived at the edge of Ridgecrest. Thomas had been the one who rode out into the hills. Eleanor had stayed closer to the cabin, tending to the domestic side of their arrangement. Now, riding alone up a pine-shadowed trail with the San Juans rising ahead of her in white-capped grandeur, she felt both the exhilaration and the vulnerability of her solitude in equal measure. The trail was easy enough to follow, carved into the mountain by years of use, flanked by quaking aspens whose new leaves trembled in the morning breeze like thousands of small silver coins. She crossed the first creek at a shallow ford, the mare splashing through without complaint. The second crossing was deeper, with a plank bridge someone had laid across it, rough-hewn but solid. Just past it, set back from the trail in a clearing that had been cut from the pines with obvious intention, she saw the cabin. It was not a rough trapper's shack as she had half expected. It was a proper structure, low and wide, built from squared logs with the chinking done carefully between each course. There was a covered porch along the front, a stone chimney at one end, and a small barn set off to the side where 2 horses stood in a corral made of split rails so perfectly fitted together they looked almost architectural. A stack of cut timber sat beside the barn, head high and many feet long, the wood pale and fresh. An axe was buried in a stump near the porch, its handle upright like a flagpole. Eleanor reined in her mare and called out from a polite distance, as manners required. "Hello? Is anyone home? I'm looking for Caleb Rourke." For a moment there was no answer, only the wind through the pines. Then the cabin door opened. He filled the doorway in a way that made Eleanor catch her breath, not from any emotion she would have been willing to name right then, but simply from the physical fact of him. Caleb Rourke was built like the mountains behind him, broad through the shoulders, thick in the chest, with forearms that showed the cord and rope of serious muscle even from where she sat on her horse. He was perhaps 30 years old, maybe a year or 2 older, with dark brown hair that fell past his ears and curled slightly at the ends, and a short beard that was several days past neat. He wore a canvas work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, dark trousers and heavy boots. His eyes, as he stepped off the porch into the morning light, were the steady gray-green of sage after rain. He looked at her with an expression that was politely unreadable. "I am Caleb Rourke. My name is Eleanor Marsh. I live down at the edge of Ridgecrest, the Marsh homestead on the South Road. Henrietta Gable sent me up." She steadied the mare, who was shifting slightly under her. "I have a problem with deer getting into my kitchen garden, and I was told you are the man to see about building a fence." He studied her for a moment, not rudely, just with the unhurried assessment of a man who took things at his own pace. Then he nodded once. "Step down if you like. I can hear what you need." She dismounted and followed him onto the porch, where he gestured to a plain wooden chair and settled himself on the porch rail with the ease of a man completely at home in his own body. She described the garden, its dimensions, the damage the deer had done, what she hoped to grow, and what she thought she needed. He listened without interrupting, asked 2 or 3 precise questions. How deep was the soil? Was the ground rocky near the edges of her plot? Were there trees close enough that deer might use them for cover on their approach? And then he was quiet for a moment, looking out at the clearing. "I can build you a fence that will keep the deer out," he said finally. 7 feet of height on the posts, split rails and wire, cedar posts because they last in wet ground. That size plot, probably 4 or 5 days of work depending on what I find when I get into the soil. He named a price that was fair, low even by her careful reckoning. "Lumber I have. I would need some wire from town." "I can buy the wire," Eleanor said quickly. She had money enough for materials, even if paying for labor was a harder stretch. "When could you start?" "I have a job I'm finishing up the day after tomorrow," he said. "I could be at your place the morning after that." "Thursday morning," she said. "Thursday morning," he confirmed. She rode home feeling something she had not felt in quite some time, something that was not exactly happiness but was adjacent to it. Purpose, maybe, or the particular warmth of knowing that something broken was going to be fixed. On Wednesday, she rode into Ridgecrest proper and bought the wire from the general store run by a man named Percy Alderman, who was curious about her plans and asked several questions she answered briefly. She also bought more bean seeds, because the summer was still young enough to replant, and a packet of marigold seeds, because someone had once told her that marigolds kept pests at bay, and she was inclined to trust any talisman she could find. She rode home and turned the damaged rows over with a hand fork, working the soil until it was loose and dark, ready for new seeds. She told herself she was not thinking about Caleb Rourke. She told herself this several times over the course of Wednesday afternoon, which was perhaps the most honest sign that she was thinking about him quite a lot. He arrived Thursday morning exactly when he said he would, before the sun had cleared the ridge fully, with a wagon loaded so heavily the boards flexed slightly under their cargo. He had cedar posts, split rails already cut to length, a box of heavy staples, wire fencing rolled into massive coils, and a post hole digger that looked capable of sinking to the center of the earth. His 2 horses pulled the wagon easily, big, powerful animals well matched to their driver. Eleanor was waiting at the garden with a cup of coffee in one hand and a second cup balanced on the fence post she'd propped against the cabin wall. She held it out when he climbed down from the wagon seat. He took it with a brief, genuine look of appreciation and drank half of it in one long pull while surveying the garden. "It is a good spot," he said. "Good sun from the south. Decent drainage." He crouched down and pressed 2 fingers into the soil near the corner of the plot, then nodded slightly as if confirming something he had suspected. "Soil is deep here. The posts will go in clean." He set down the empty cup and went to work. Eleanor had planned to let him work and stay out of his way, occupying herself with the 100 other tasks that demanded attention around the homestead. But she found herself pausing frequently in whatever she was doing, hanging washing on the line, weeding the small herb bed near the porch, repairing a loose board on the front steps, to watch him. Not obviously, she hoped, but she watched. He worked with an efficiency that was almost beautiful. Every motion had a purpose. He used the post hole digger with the same ease another man might use a spoon, driving it into the earth in rhythmic strokes that sent the loosened soil cascading to either side, sinking the holes 2 feet deep in soil that would have required a full day's effort from Eleanor. He set the cedar posts, checked each one for plumb with a level he pulled from his belt, and tamped the earth around them with a heavy-headed rod before moving to the next. His shirt darkened with sweat across his back and shoulders by mid-morning, and when he paused to strip it off and drape it over the wagon, Eleanor found a sudden urgent need to examine the underside of the porch railing very carefully. She brought him water at midday, and he thanked her without the self-consciousness she had half expected. He sat on the ground near the garden, long legs stretched out, drinking from the tin cup she'd brought, looking at the line of posts he had set along 2 full sides of the garden. There were 12 posts in the ground, standing straight and solid as sentinels. "You are making good progress," she said, for want of something to say. "Ground is cooperating," he replied. "I hit a rock on the east corner, had to shift the post 6 inches, but the alignment held." He looked at the posts with the same quiet assessment she had noticed in him the first day, as though he were always measuring things, calculating stresses and loads and endurance. "Should have all the posts in today. Tomorrow I will start on the rails and wire." "Can I ask?" she said, and then hesitated, because she was not sure the question was appropriate. He looked up at her calmly. "You can ask. How did you come to do this kind of work, building things, out here alone?" He was quiet for a moment, and the way she was learning was characteristic of him, not reluctance, but genuine consideration. "I came out here from Missouri 11 years ago. Came out with a group heading for the mining camps. Ended up not being a miner." He said this with a small, dry note that might have been humor. "Turned out I was better suited to building things than digging for silver. I spent a few years working construction in Denver, then came up into the mountains about 5 years ago. I like the quiet. I like having enough timber to work with." "Do you not find it lonely?" She asked this before she could stop herself, and felt the question expose more of herself than she had intended. He looked at her steadily. "Sometimes," he said. "You?" The directness of the return question caught her off guard, and she laughed slightly, a short, unguarded sound that surprised them both. "Yes," she admitted. "Often?" He nodded once without pity or excessive sympathy, which was the right response. He finished his water and stood up, and they went back to their respective work. That evening, after he had packed his tools into the wagon and driven back up the mountain, Eleanor stood at the kitchen window and looked at the 2 sides of posts that now stood around her garden. They were tall and straight and already transforming the space, giving it a sense of permanence it had not had before. In the fading light, the cedar posts gleamed pale gold. She thought about his gray-green eyes and the way he had answered her question about loneliness with a question of his own, and she told herself again that she was not thinking about him, and again she knew it for the lie it was. He came back Friday morning with the same unhurried punctuality, and Saturday morning too, and by the end of Saturday afternoon, the fence was complete. It stood 7 feet high on all 4 sides, the cedar posts connected first by 3 horizontal rails of split timber and then by wire mesh that was stapled so tightly it rang like a low note when Eleanor pressed her palm against it. The gate was hung on heavy iron hinges that he had forged himself, she realized. Each hinge was slightly different from mass-produced hardware, shaped with clear craft. The latch was a simple lift and drop mechanism, smooth and silent. Eleanor walked around the outside of the fence once, then opened the gate and walked the interior, running her hand along the wire. The garden inside felt transformed, not smaller, but more purposeful, more protected, as if it had suddenly acquired a future it had not been certain of before. Caleb was cleaning his tools on the back of the wagon when she came out, wiping the blades with an oiled cloth in long, deliberate strokes. She stood in the yard watching him and knew that she did not want him to leave. It was the simplest and most startling thought she had had in 8 months. "It is better than I imagined," she said. "It is exactly right." He looked up from his tools. "The deer will not get through it," he said. "If they jump the fence, which they may try a few times out of stubbornness, the wire will persuade them. After a season, they will find easier grazing and forget yours entirely." "Will you stay for supper?" she asked. The words came out steadier than she felt. "I have a stew already started. It seems a poor payment for 3 days of work, but it is something." He hesitated. Genuinely, she thought, not performatively. He looked at his tools, at the horse, at the fence, and then at her. "I would like that," he said. He unhitched the horses and let them drink at the trough by the barn while Eleanor laid the small table inside the cabin. She lit the lamp when the evening light dimmed below usefulness, and the cabin filled with its warm, amber glow. She had a good stew, beef, and root vegetables she'd been watching all afternoon, and she cut thick slices from a loaf of bread she had baked 2 days ago. He ate with an appetite that was flattering to her cooking, and appreciative without being excessive, and he looked around the cabin with the appraising eye of a man who understands construction. "You have kept this place well," he said. "The chinkling on the north wall. Did you do that yourself?" "I did. Last autumn. There was a draft coming in that was making me miserable." She passed him more bread. "I read about the technique in a pamphlet. I'm not certain it is done the way a professional would do it." "It is done fine," he said, "better than some I have seen done by men who should have known better." She asked him about the work he had done in Denver before coming to the mountains, and he talked about it more than she had expected. He seemed to find the topic genuinely interesting rather than just obligatory conversation, describing the buildings going up along the main streets, the architectural ambitions of a city still deciding what it wanted to be, the challenges of construction at altitude where the weather turned savage without much warning. He talked about wood, about the properties of different timbers, the way cedar and spruce and pine each behave differently under load and over time. It was technical and specific, and she found herself genuinely drawn in, asking real questions, and he answered them with the slightly surprised pleasure of a man unaccustomed to finding his expertise interesting to anyone else. Outside the windows, the Colorado night settled in deep and cold, the stars coming out brilliant and thick above the mountain. At some point, Eleanor realized they had been sitting at the table for 2 hours, and the stew pot was empty, and she had refilled his coffee cup 3 times, and she did not want the evening to end. He left when the night had fully arrived, thanking her for the meal with a directness and warmth that was neither formal nor overfamiliar. And she stood on the porch and watched the lantern on his wagon diminish up the mountain trail until the pines swallowed it. Then she went inside and sat by the dying fire for a long time, not reading, not sewing, just thinking. The next morning she replanted the damaged beans, pressing the seeds into the dark, turned earth with careful attention. She worked her way around the interior of the fence, checking that the soil along each edge was properly tilled, smoothing and firming. The garden smelled of good earth and possibility. Through the open gate, she could see the meadow and the tree line, and twice while she worked, she saw the dark, elegant shapes of deer moving along the edge of the aspens, watching, she supposed, or perhaps just passing. They came no closer. She thought about the fence as she worked, about what it meant to have something built for you, built well and built to last. Thomas had built things for her too, of course, but Thomas had been her husband, and the labor of a husband and the labor of a man who had come as a stranger and built something strong and good were not, she discovered, the same feeling. The difference had something to do with the fact that Caleb had listened carefully to what she needed. He had asked the right questions. He had not assumed he knew better. The following Thursday, nearly a week after the fence was finished, she heard the sound of a horse on the trail and looked out to find Caleb Rourke riding down from the mountain on one of his big horses, with no wagon behind him and no obvious professional purpose. He reined in at her gate, the front gate of the yard, not the garden gate, and looked at her with the same unhurried expression he always wore. "I was coming down to town for supplies," he said. "Thought I would stop and see how the garden was getting on." Eleanor set down the mending she was doing on the porch and looked at him with a composure she was very much constructing on purpose. "The beans are already coming up again," she said. 3 days ago there was nothing, and now I have 2 full rows of seedlings. Come and see if you like." He dismounted, tied his horse to the post at the yard gate, and followed her around to the garden. She opened the latch and let them both in, and they stood in the middle of the plot surrounded by the growing things, the short green lines of bean seedlings, the thicker, more determined rows of carrots, the vigorous sprawl of the squash that had taken off with the recent warm weather, and at the south end, a full row of tomato plants that Eleanor had transplanted from seedlings she had started indoors in February. "You have a good hand with plants," Caleb said. He was looking at the tomatoes with genuine appreciation. "Those are further along than they should be for May. I started them early. I had the seedling boxes near the stove all through March." She touched the top of one of the plants gently. "Thomas always loved a tomato fresh off the vine. I suppose I wanted them for that reason." She paused, aware she had introduced her dead husband into the conversation, and looked sideways at Caleb to gauge the impact. He was looking at the tomato plant. "I'm sorry about your husband," he said simply. "Henrietta told me. It was a bad thing to happen." "It was," she said. "He was a good man. He did not deserve to go the way he went." Silence settled between them, not uncomfortable. The aspens beyond the fence whispered in a small breeze. "Do you plan to stay?" he asked. "After this summer? The winter up here is not forgiving." "I know that," she said a little sharply, and then softened the edge of it. "I survived last winter. I intend to survive the next one." She looked at the fence, at the clean lines of the cedar posts, at the wire that stood between her garden and the hunger of the wild things. "This is my land. I filed on this claim myself after Thomas died. It is mine, and I mean to keep it." He looked at her with something in his expression that she could not name precisely, but recognized nonetheless, a kind of respect that was deeper than the polite surface-level variety, the respect of one person who endures hard things for another who does the same. "Good," he said, quietly and with finality. He stayed another hour, helping her mend a section of the corral fence that had been bothering her for weeks, the kind of task she had been putting off because it required driving new posts, and she did not feel confident in her post setting. He did it quickly, and without being asked a second time, and she brought him water and watched the work and did not feel like watching was passive. It felt like participation. When he left for town, she stood at the fence and watched him go, and when she went back to her porch and her mending, she was smiling in a way she had not noticed herself doing in a very long time. June arrived in a rush of warmth and color, the mountain meadows exploding with wildflowers, the aspens fully leaved now and shimmering constantly in the mountain thermals. Eleanor's garden grew with a vigor that surprised even her. The beans climbed their poles, the squash spread its enormous leaves across half the southern end, the tomatoes fruited early and abundantly, and the carrots came in thick and sweet. She kept the gate carefully latched, and every evening she walked the perimeter of the fence checking the wire, not because she expected breaches, but because the act of checking had become a kind of ritual, a way of assessing and appreciating what had been built for her. Caleb came down from the mountain regularly now, more regularly than his supply trips required, she had begun to suspect. He always had a stated purpose. He brought her a load of firewood from a stand of dead pine he had cleared on his property, because it was never too early to start building the winter supply. He came to check whether the southwest corner post had settled correctly after the heavy rain in early June, which it had. He came because a deer had breached the fence of Henrietta's garden, not Eleanor's, but Henrietta's, and he wanted to look at both fences and compare the technique. Each time, he stayed longer than the stated purpose required, and each time, Eleanor found herself less inclined to mind. They fell into a particular rhythm of conversation that she could not have described to anyone else, but that felt entirely natural. They talked about the practical realities of mountain living, the best way to preserve the summer garden for winter, the relative merits of different firewood species, the strange and unreliable behavior of the local weather, which could deliver a June snowstorm with no apparent concern for the calendar. But they also talked about other things, deeper things, stories from their pasts. He told her about growing up in Missouri, the son of a carpenter who had taught him everything about working wood before dying of pneumonia when Caleb was 17, leaving him and a younger sister to navigate the world. The sister had married a farmer and stayed in Missouri. Caleb wrote her letters when he could and received them months later after they had made their circuitous way up the mountains. Eleanor told him about growing up in Ohio, one of 5 daughters of a schoolteacher father who had believed passionately in educating his girls as well as any son. She had been the most bookish of the 5, the most stubborn, the one who had insisted on coming west, when Thomas Marsh, an Ohio farmer turned Colorado homesteader, had asked her to marry him 5 years ago. Her father had cried when she left. She still thought about that. "Do you miss Ohio?" Caleb asked one evening. They were sitting on her porch in the late blue dusk of a mountain evening, the mountains behind the cabin still holding the last of the sunset on their white peaks. He was in the chair, and she was on the porch steps, and the distance between them was comfortable and charged with something that neither of them had yet named. "I miss my family," she said honestly. "I do not miss Ohio. I think I was always meant for someplace larger." She gestured outward at the mountains, the sky, the immensity of the dark coming down over the landscape. "This is the right size. Does that sound strange?" "No," he said. "It is the same reason I stayed. When I first came over the pass into this country, I felt like I'd been walking in a room that was too small all my life, and suddenly, someone opened a door." She looked at him in the blue half-light and felt something shift in her chest, a quiet but decisive movement, like a door settling into a frame it had been slightly off from for a long time. She looked away before he could notice the shift in her expression, but from the quality of the silence that followed, she thought perhaps he had noticed it anyway. On a bright Saturday in late June, Ridgecrest had its summer social, a tradition that the settlement maintained with considerable determination. A potluck gathering held in the meadow behind the general store, with fiddle music and dancing and competitive pie-making and the general social maintenance that kept isolated people from becoming too isolated. Eleanor had attended the previous summer's social with Thomas, still new to the territory, overwhelmed and nervous. This year she went alone, carrying a pot of slow-cooked beans seasoned with smoked pork, and she wore her good blue dress that she had let out slightly at the waist and taken in slightly at the shoulders, because her body was different than it had been a year ago, more muscled from outdoor work, leaner from a difficult winter. She arrived to find the usual crowd, the Gable family and their connections, the Alderman brothers from the store, several families from outlying homesteads, the Harmon family who ran the small hotel at the edge of town. Henrietta immediately claimed her, as Eleanor had known she would, and introduced her to 3 different young women who were, Henrietta said significantly, also living alone, as though the condition were a club with membership requirements. Eleanor was talking to one of these women, a pleasant redhead named Clara Whitfield, who ran a small boarding house, when she heard the particular quality of attention shift in the crowd behind her, and turned to find that Caleb had arrived. He was dressed more carefully than she had ever seen him, clean work shirt, dark trousers without any visible sawdust, his hair smoothed back but still curling slightly at his collar, his beard trimmed close. He was carrying a large covered dish of something, moving through the gathering with the same ease he did everything, and several people called out his name in genuine welcome, because it was apparent that Caleb Rourke was well regarded in Ridgecrest in the uncomplicated way of a man who could be relied upon. He spotted her from across the meadow, and his expression did something that Clara Whitfield, standing at Eleanor's elbow, did not miss. "Oh my," Clara said, with quiet satisfaction. "He built my fence," Eleanor said firmly, as though this were a complete description of the situation. Said Clara, in a tone that suggested she found this taxonomy entirely inadequate. Caleb made his way toward her with no pretense of doing otherwise, delivered his dish to the food table, and appeared at her side with the straightforward purposefulness that characterized him. "Your garden looks well this week," he said, as though they had been in the middle of a conversation. "I rode past on my way down." "The tomatoes are setting fruit," she said, "faster than I expected." "It has been a warm June." "It has." They stood side by side in the meadow while the fiddle tuned up and children ran past and the mountains looked down at everything with their permanent, indifferent beauty. When the dancing started, reels mostly, and a couple of simpler patterns that even the most unpracticed dancers could manage. He looked at her with a directness that was slightly different from his usual steadiness, something warmer in it, more openly hopeful. "Will you dance?" he asked. She took his hand. He was a better dancer than she had expected, or perhaps dancing with someone his size and strength was simply easier than dancing with smaller men. There was no anxiety about collision or misstep, because he kept her firmly and gently in the pattern with a hand at her back that was warm through the thin cotton of her dress. They danced 2 reels, and then a slower piece the fiddler played, something wistful and sweet. And by the time that was done, Eleanor was flushed and laughing in a way she could not have predicted, and Caleb was smiling in a way she had not seen before, free and unguarded. They ate together, sitting on the grass slightly apart from the main gathering, and he told her about the covered dish he had brought, a smoked venison with dried berries that was a recipe from, of all things, a French-Canadian trapper he had befriended in his early years in the mountains, a man who could do extraordinary things with whatever game was available. She told him about her mother's bean recipe, which was what she had brought and which had been handed down from her grandmother, and they ate both dishes in a companionable negotiation of sharing that felt entirely and startlingly domestic. When the evening wound down and the stars came thick and clear above the meadow, he walked her to her horse with his hand very lightly at her back, and she was intensely aware of every point of contact. "I will come by Tuesday," he said. "I want to look at the gate hardware. I want to make sure the latch is seated right after all the opening and closing." "The latch is fine," she said, and she looked up at him in the starlight and added, "But come on Tuesday anyway." The silence that followed lasted 3 full seconds, during which Eleanor felt every one of her 26 years and all the winter she had endured, and all the loneliness and all the tentative, reluctant hope that had been building in her since a morning in May when a mountain man filled a doorway and changed something she had not expected to have changed. "I will," he said. She rode home in the warm June dark, feeling like the world had rearranged itself around her while she was not paying attention, and she found she was glad of the rearrangement. Tuesday came with a summer storm that rolled in over the mountains in the early morning, dropping cold rain and a considerable amount of thunder. Caleb arrived despite it, soaked to the skin, his dark hair plastered flat and rain running off him in streams. Eleanor pulled the door open and looked at him, and then looked at the storm and said the only sensible thing, which was, "Get inside." He sat at her kitchen table dripping while she found him a dry shirt of Thomas's that she had not yet disposed of. She had been uncertain what to do with Thomas's clothes, and so had done nothing, which now proved providential, and went out of the room while he changed. When she came back in with towels and a pot of coffee, he was sitting at the table in the shirt that was slightly too short in the arms for him, the towel around his shoulders, and he looked so entirely normal and right, sitting there in her kitchen, that it made her pause in the doorway for a moment before she could move again. "The latch can wait," she said, setting down the coffee and the cups. "The latch can wait," he agreed. The storm lasted most of the day. They talked without stopping, or nearly without stopping, with the comfortable ease of people who have moved past the stage of calibrated conversation into the stage of genuine exchange. She showed him the books she had carried all the way from Ohio, which was nearly 2 dozen, an extravagance she had never regretted, and he looked at them with the careful attention of a man who had read widely despite having had few books of his own. He borrowed a surveying and land measurement text that had belonged to her father, which she had brought west because Thomas had found it useful, and he talked about it with a fluency that made her realize he was not the rough-edged frontiersman she had in some incautious part of her imagination initially categorized him as, but rather a man of considerable intelligence who had simply chosen a life that did not require him to perform it. In the middle of the afternoon, with the rain still running in sheets against the windows, she was reading in the chair by the stove while he was at the table, making notes in a small worn journal he had pulled from his coat pocket, and she looked up and found him watching her with an expression that was so unshielded and warm that she felt it like heat. She did not look away this time. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes," she said, not as a response, but as a statement of her own. He set down the journal. He stood up from the table and crossed the small room and crouched down beside the chair so that they were on the same level, and he looked at her with those gray-green eyes that she had been trying not to think about since the second week of May. "I am not very practiced at saying things like this," he said. "I want you to know that I am aware of that." "I'm not very practiced at hearing them," she said. "So we are even." "I think about you," he said. "I think about you a good deal. I want to know if that is something you want." She set her book down. She put her hand on his where it rested on the arm of the chair, and she felt him go very still. "Yes," she said, "it is something I want." He turned his hand over and held hers, and outside the storm moved through the mountains with its extravagant indifference, and inside the small warm cabin something as necessary and natural as the rain began. They were careful with it, both of them, careful and honest in a way that she appreciated more than any grand declaration would have provided. They were both people who had been tested and warned somewhat by the life they had chosen, and they understood each other's caution without needing to explain it. He came down from the mountain regularly and openly now, no longer requiring the pretense of gate hardware or firewood delivery. He came because he wanted to see her, and she received him because she wanted him there. He met the complications of her grief with the same steady patience he brought to everything. He did not require her to be over Thomas, did not compete with a dead man's memory, did not diminish the loss by being impatient with its lingering presence. When she missed Thomas, which happened in particular quiet moments, she told Caleb, and he listened, and the honesty of it made the grief cleaner somehow, less entangled with guilt. She was not disloyal to Thomas by opening her heart again. She was, she came to believe, honoring the fact that Thomas had always wanted her to be well. July in the high country was magnificent. Eleanor's garden reached its full summer glory, everything fruiting and flowering simultaneously. The tomatoes going red in a cascade she could not harvest fast enough, the beans producing so abundantly that she was reduced to giving them away to neighbors, the squash growing to a size that Caleb, when he saw them, regarded with something close to professional admiration. The marigolds she had planted around the perimeter were brilliant orange and yellow, their sharp scent doing what it was supposed to do, and not a single deer breached the fence that summer, not one. She began canning in earnest in mid-July, spending long hot days at the stove with the cabin windows open and the smell of vinegar and hot jars and cooked tomato drifting out into the summer air. Caleb helped her carry the firewood she needed for the canning fire and built her a second work table from some spare lumber so she had more surface area for the cooling jars. He did these things quietly and without announcement, the way he did everything, and she found that the quality of his love, if that was what it was becoming, was expressed almost entirely in this willingness to see what was needed and provide it without being asked and without requiring acknowledgement. But he also told her he was not a man of endless words, but he used the words he had with a precision that moved her. One evening in late July, sitting on her porch with the mountains going pink and gold in the sunset, he said, "I have not been this happy in a long time. I want you to know that." He said it simply, looking at the mountains, not making it into more than it was, which somehow made it more than anything more elaborate would have been. She took his hand and held it for a moment, feeling his calluses and his warmth and the weight of what she was allowing herself to feel. "Neither have I," she said. Late August brought a decision. Caleb had begun spending less time on the mountain and more time at the homestead, to the point where their respective properties had developed a kind of gravitational relationship. He was present for most of her days. He slept at his own cabin, making the mountain ride in the early dark like a man who understood that proprieties in a small settlement mattered and had consequences, but he was there by morning most days and gone late each evening. Eleanor had noticed how the town observed this with a mixture of approval and curiosity. Henrietta had been nothing but pleased, with the particular satisfaction of someone whose matchmaking instinct had been vindicated. Clara Whitfield had asked with considerable directness when Eleanor was going to do something about the situation. Eleanor had thought about it. She had thought about it very carefully. On a morning in late August, with the first hint of autumn beginning to color the highest aspens and a crispness in the early air that was a message from the winter coming, she asked him to sit down at the kitchen table. He sat, reading her face, and he was quiet. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want to ask it directly, because I think we are both people who appreciate directness." "We are," he agreed, watching her. "I want to know if you intend to make something formal of this," she said. "Of us. Because the winter is coming, and I have been thinking about it seriously, and I do not want to go into another winter alone if I do not have to." She paused. "And because I love you. Not because I am afraid of the winter. Because I love you." The silence lasted 2 seconds, and then he said, "I was going to ask you the same thing. I've been figuring out how to ask it for 2 weeks." "Well," she said. "Well," he said. And then he stood up and crossed to her side of the table, and he was much warmer and much larger than was strictly convenient when she was trying to appear composed, and he took both her hands and said very quietly and seriously, "Eleanor Marsh, I would like very much to marry you. I've wanted to ask since July, and I have been a coward about it." She looked up at him, at this man who had come down from the mountain and built her a fence and stayed for everything else. "You are the least cowardly person I have ever met," she said. "On most subjects," he allowed. "Not on this one." She laughed, and he laughed, and she said yes. They were married in September, just before the aspens turned fully gold, in a small ceremony at the settlement's modest community hall, performed by a circuit judge who came through Ridgecrest every month. Henrietta attended with great satisfaction and a magnificent apple cake. Clara Whitfield and her husband came. A dozen neighbors and homesteaders gathered, because word had spread quickly, and people in isolated settlements understand the importance of celebrations. Caleb wore the cleanest shirt Eleanor had ever seen him in, and looked like a mountain himself, straight and solid, with his hair combed back and his gray-green eyes finding hers immediately when she came through the door and not leaving them again. She wore her best dress altered to fit her current self, with a spray of late wildflowers she had gathered that morning and pinned into her dark hair. She walked toward him on her own, having no one to give her away and finding this entirely appropriate. She was not being given, she was choosing, and there was a difference that mattered deeply to her. When the judge asked if she was willing to take this man, she said yes with a firmness that made several of the assembled company smile. They moved Caleb's most essential belongings down the mountain to the homestead in the weeks following the wedding. Some things he kept at the mountain cabin, which he intended to maintain for the times when he was working on upper elevation properties. But the homestead became the center. Together they were stronger than either alone, and both of them felt this not as a sentiment, but as a practical fact, an arithmetic of self-sufficiency that made difficult things manageable. The work of preparing for winter was more efficient with 2 people. Caleb cut and stacked firewood until the woodpile was a full 8 feet high along the south wall of the cabin. Eleanor put up more than 60 jars of preserved vegetables, fruits, and pickles from the garden's abundance. Together, they repaired the barn roof where a board had cracked, re-chinked the north wall of the cabin more thoroughly than Eleanor's previous attempt, and fortified the root cellar against the freezing temperatures it would need to withstand. One afternoon in October, with the aspens now in full gold glory and the first skiff of snow on the peaks above them, Caleb stood in the garden, standing in it with her for the first time, not just checking his work from outside it, and she looked at the bare, turned-over beds and the standing posts and the taut, sturdy wire, and felt something she could only describe as a full and quiet happiness. "Next year," she said, "I want to expand it, add another 20 feet on the south side, enough for a proper herb garden and maybe some summer wheat." He was looking at the structure with the evaluating gaze of a builder considering what the structure could bear. "The south posts will handle an extension," he said. "We would need to sink 4 more, maybe 5, and another section of wire." He looked at her. "I can do that in a day in May when the ground is workable." "We can do it," she said. He looked at her for a moment with something that was beyond ordinary happiness in its quality, something that had to do with being seen and claimed in the same moment. "We can," he agreed. The winter came hard, as Colorado winters did, and it came early. By November, the mountain was locked in snow, and the trails above them were impassable except on snowshoes, and the small homestead became an island in a white world. There were hard days. A 3-day blizzard in December that confined them to the cabin and required Caleb to shovel continuously to keep the snow from collapsing the barn roof. A week in January when the temperature dropped so far below 0 that the water in the horse trough froze solid each night and had to be broken every morning with an axe. Eleanor came down with a chest cold in February that lingered for 2 weeks and frightened them both, though she was stubborn about recovering and did recover fully. But there was also the extraordinary compensation of enduring hard things together. There was the warmth of the cabin at night with the fire going and the wind banging at the walls and 2 people who understood each other's silences. There were the long evenings reading by lamplight, the games of cards they invented variations of, the long conversations that ranged everywhere and stopped nowhere. He carved her a small wooden box for her sewing things over the course of several evenings, working at the kitchen table by lamplight with tools she had not known he could use for delicate work. And the box, when he finished it, had a lid with a carved design of aspen leaves and mountain peaks that was so precise and beautiful that she held it for a long time without saying anything. "Caleb," she said finally. "I know," he said, not looking up, but he was smiling. Spring returned, as it always does in the mountains, with extravagant drama. Late snowstorms followed by days of such warmth and brilliance that the whole world seemed to be apologizing for winter. Eleanor went to the garden in the first real thaw week to assess what the cold had done, and found the posts standing as straight as the day they had been sunk, the wire intact, the cedar wood of the rails looking if anything slightly mellowed and enriched by the season's stress, as good cedar tends to do. Thomas's fence, she still called it that sometimes in her head, Caleb's fence, the fence that had started everything, had survived the mountain winter without a single failure. She planted earlier that second year, with the confidence of a woman who knew this particular ground's temper now. She started more indoors, gave herself more lead time, was bolder with the quantities. Caleb built the extension as he had promised, sinking 5 new posts into the south side one warm May morning, adding the rails and the wire, and expanding the garden to a size that was now, she felt, not merely a survival measure, but an expression of intent. This was a farm. This was a life. He had taken on more building work that spring as more settlers arrived in the territory, people coming in on the railroad that had reached closer to the mountains every year, bringing with them the money and ambitions that kept a man like Caleb busy from spring through fall. But he was careful about the work he took and the distance it required, and he came home at night. Home. The word had weight when he used it, and she heard the weight. In the spring of 1876, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. She told Caleb in the evening, after supper, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the mountain dark outside the windows. She had suspected for 2 weeks, and was certain now, and she had been finding the right moment. She told him directly, as she always told him things. He was still for a long moment, then he reached across the table and took her hand in both of his, and she saw his jaw work slightly with something he was working to contain, and she knew it was joy. "Are you well?" he asked. "I feel fine," she said. "I'm strong. I'm not worried." "I'm a little worried," he admitted, and she loved him for the honesty of it. "Then we will be a little worried together," she said, "and we will also be very happy. Together." He kissed her hand, which was something he did sometimes, a gesture she had not seen coming from him at first, and now considered one of her favorite things about him. "Yes," he said, "very happy." The pregnancy was healthy, as Eleanor had been confident it would be. She was a strong, well-nourished woman on good food and clean mountain air, and the main difficulty was the late months, when August heat was unusual for the mountains, but arrived that year with unusual determination, and she was very large and very warm and rather more short-tempered than she was comfortable with. Caleb accommodated her short temper with a patience that occasionally she recognized as heroic. He did not manage her or condescend to her, he simply stayed close and stayed gentle. Their son was born in October of 1876, in the cabin, delivered by a competent midwife from Ridgecrest named Sarah Hooper, who had been making the mountain journey for 3 days by the time she was finally called for. He was a large, loud, healthy baby with a remarkable volume of dark hair and a set of opinions that he expressed clearly from his first moments. Eleanor held him and felt the weight of him against her chest, and something opened up in her that she had not known was closed. They named him William Thomas Rourke, William for Caleb's father, Thomas for Eleanor's first husband, because Caleb had suggested it, and she had wept when he did, because it was the most generous and loving thing he could have done, and because it was exactly right. Caleb held his son on the first morning after the birth, standing by the window in the early light with William wrapped against his chest, looking at the infant's face with an expression Eleanor committed to memory permanently. He was still in the careful, wondering way that she associated with him looking at something he was measuring. But this time, what he was measuring was love itself, and he was finding it immeasurable. The years that followed were full years, the kind that a person lives and does not realize they are living perfectly until long afterward. William grew from a loud, determined baby into a loud, determined toddler with his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's dark hair and a personality that seemed to belong entirely to itself, a small, bold creature who had strong opinions about everything and was apparently completely unafraid of anything in the physical world. Caleb taught him to identify different trees by their bark before he could spell his own name. Eleanor read to him every night from the time he could focus on her face, and he was the kind of child who listened to books with his whole body. In the summer of 1878, their second child arrived, a girl they named Clara Rose, after the boarding house-keeping friend who had been the first outsider to see what Eleanor and Caleb were to each other, and for the wild roses that bloomed on the south side of the fence every June. Clara Rose was quieter than her brother, dark-eyed and thoughtful, watching the world with an evaluative gaze that her parents recognized as Caleb's. The garden grew every year, incrementally, bounded always by the original fence that remained as sound as ever. Caleb replaced 2 posts in its 5th year, not because they had failed, but because he saw the first signs of age in the wood and chose to act before failure rather than after, which was his general philosophy applied to everything. He showed William how to check fence posts by pressing against them and reading the resistance, a lesson the boy took with complete seriousness at the age of 4. He showed Clara Rose the same lesson 2 years later, and she applied it with the methodical thoroughness of someone who would rather know something truly than know it approximately. The settlement of Ridgecrest grew throughout the late 1870s as the railroad continued its progress and the territory moved toward statehood. Colorado became the 38th state of the Union in August of 1876, an event that Ridgecrest celebrated with a bonfire and considerable fiddle music and speeches of varying quality. Eleanor and Caleb attended with William, who was not yet a year old, and slept through the speeches in a carrying cloth against Eleanor's chest, which Eleanor considered the optimal way to approach a political speech. Henrietta Gable died in the winter of 1879, peacefully, and at an age she had always been somewhat vague about, but that everyone agreed was considerable, and Eleanor grieved for her with an earnestness that reflected how much she owed the sharp-eyed old woman who had sent her up the mountain to a man with an axe in a stump and gray-green eyes. Caleb and Eleanor sat with her in her final weeks, and after she was gone, Caleb built the coffin himself from cedar, the same wood he had used for Eleanor's fence, and it was the most tender thing Eleanor had ever seen him do with his hands. In 1880, 4 years after William's birth, Eleanor was pregnant again. She felt it with a different quality this time, more settled, more experienced, less anxious. Caleb was calmer too, though no less attentive. This birth was faster and easier than the first, and produced a second son, whom they named James, and who arrived in the world with such an air of contentment and philosophical acceptance that Eleanor said, looking at his serene newborn face, "This one is going to be all right." All three of them are going to be all right, Caleb said, from his usual position near the window where he liked to hold the new babies in the morning light. You are impossibly confident, she said, smiling. I am realistically confident, he said. I know who their mother is. James grew into the most companionable and easygoing child Eleanor had encountered in her experience, which by the standards of the early 1880s was becoming extensive as the settlement's population grew. He followed William everywhere with the devoted tolerance of a younger sibling who has decided that adoration is more efficient than competition. And William, for his part, taught James everything he knew with the proprietary enthusiasm of a firstborn who has discovered the pleasure of having an audience. Clara Rose, between her two brothers, developed early the capacity for independent thought and decisive action that would characterize her entire life. She was in the garden with Eleanor almost every day from the time she could walk steadily, showing a particular affinity for the plants that produced the most dramatic results. She had, by the age of 6, opinions about the relative merits of different tomato planting schedules that she expressed with a confidence that made her father smile behind his coffee cup. The fence endured. It was a subject that became something of a legend in the Rourke household, not a deliberate legend, but the kind that grows organically from something that holds up long enough to become remarkable. Every spring, Caleb walked the perimeter and assessed and maintained, replacing a staple here and a bit of wire there, checking the posts, reseating the gate hinges when they showed the first signs of wear. He did this maintenance with William from the time the boy was old enough to carry tools, and then with Clara Rose, who insisted on being included, and eventually with James as well, until the annual fence inspection became a family ritual as reliable as the planting and the harvest. Eleanor replanted marigolds around the perimeter every year without fail. The bright orange and yellow border had become, after a decade, a feature of the garden so established that it seemed as natural as anything else growing there. The deer still came to the tree line sometimes, still moved along the meadow edge in the thin blue light of early morning, still watched with their large, patient eyes, but they came no closer than the fence, and they had not breached it in the 12 years since it was built. She thought about this sometimes, the way small, practical acts could become the architecture of everything that followed. A deer had eaten her beans. She had gone up a mountain. A man had filled a doorway. And from those simple, accidental facts had grown the whole structure of her life as it was now. The house expanded and improved by the same hands that had built the fence, the children growing in its shadow, the marriage that was better in its 10th year than it had been in its first, because they were both people who improved with time, and so did everything they made together. She was in the garden on a June morning in 1886. She had not thought carefully about the date as it approached, and then suddenly she was standing in the garden with her hands in the soil, and she realized it was 12 years, nearly exactly, since Caleb had sunk the first post, when Caleb came through the gate behind her and stood quietly for a moment. She looked up at him. He was in his early 40s now, the beard fully maintained, the hair more carefully tended than when she had met him, though still curling past his collar in the way she loved, the body still that of a man built for serious labor, though the deep mountain winters had added gravity and stillness to what had always been there. He looked exactly like himself, she thought, only more so. He was holding 2 cups of coffee, which he handed her as she straightened from the bean row she had been weeding. "Do you know what today is?" she asked. He looked at her with the slight tucked expression that meant he did know, and had been waiting to see if she would bring it up. "The 17th of June, he said. "Approximately 12 years, she said. He looked around the garden, at the deep beds, the established plantings, the expanding north end where she had added a proper herb section 3 years ago, the south end that had been expanded twice, at the marigolds, which were just beginning to bud, at the fence, which stood as straight as it had in 1874, cedar posts weathered to a silver-brown, wire taut, rails solid. 12 years, he said. They stood there together in the garden in the June morning, the mountains above them holding the last of the winter on their peaks, the meadow below them going summer green. Inside the house, James, who was 5 now, could be heard explaining something to his sister Clara Rose with great urgency. William, 10 years old and increasingly autonomous, was probably at the barn, which was where he went when he wanted solitude in the way of his father. "Do you remember," she said, "when you came back that first week after the fence was done? You said you were coming to check the gate hardware." He looked at her with total composure. The gate hardware needed checking. "It absolutely did not," she said. "There was," he said carefully, "a potential issue with the latch alignment that I felt should be monitored." She laughed the way she always laughed at this particular piece of fiction they maintained between them, fully and without restraint, and he smiled in the way that was still, after 12 years, one of the best things she had ever seen, private and warm, meant only for her. "I am glad you came back," she said. He took the coffee cup from her hand and held her hand instead, standing in the garden with the sun coming warm off the mountains and the marigolds starting and the beans climbing their poles, the fence straight and the gate latched and the deer somewhere beyond the tree line, finding easier grazing, as he had promised they eventually would. "So am I," he said. That summer was an abundant one, the garden outdoing itself in the way of gardens that have had a decade of careful tending layered into the soil. Eleanor put up more than 100 jars, a number she wrote in the household journal she had been keeping since the first year of their marriage with a quiet satisfaction. William took on more responsibility in the barn that summer, managing the 2 horses and the small number of cattle they now kept, with a competence that made Caleb watch him, with the particular pride of a father recognizing himself in good form. Clara Rose decided she was going to plant her own small bed within the garden, separate from her mother's organization, and spent an entire afternoon laying it out with stakes and string, a level of planning that Eleanor did not interfere with because it was so clearly right. James, 5 years old and in possession of the serene certainty that he was loved completely, spent his summer helping in the garden at a 5-year-old's level of help, which meant carrying small things from here to there, watering with excessive enthusiasm, and providing a running commentary on the progress of the plants that was often incorrect but always earnest. He had a particular attachment to the bean plants, which he referred to as his beans on no particular basis, and he checked on them every morning with the gravity of a doctor on rounds. In September of 1886, Caleb completed the construction of a proper workshop behind the barn, a building he had been planning for 2 years, and that was built with the same care as everything he made. It had a proper floor, a workbench along 3 walls, good ventilation for sawdust, and a stove for the winter months. It formalized something that had been improvised for 12 years and gave the craft that had underwritten everything a proper home. He moved his tools in on a Saturday with William's help, arranging them with the precision of a man who knows the value of every instrument he owns, and then he stood in the center of the workshop and looked at it with an expression that Eleanor, watching from the doorway, recognized as the same expression he had worn looking at his newborn children, the look of a man assessing something he has made and finding it good. "It is a good shop," she said. "It will do," he said, which in Caleb Rourke's vocabulary was the highest praise. He began teaching William to work wood that winter. The boy was 10 and ready, and had been watching his father work since before he could walk steadily, accumulating without effort the absorbed knowledge of a child who has grown up in the presence of skilled work. He started with simple joints, with the feel of different woods under the plane, with the grammar of measuring twice before cutting once, which Caleb taught with a patience that never wavered even when William was impatient with himself. Clara Rose watched these lessons and then asked to be included, and after a single week's experiment in which she demonstrated more natural feel for the tools than her brother, Caleb adjusted his lesson plan without comment to include her fully. Eleanor watched all of this from the cabin and the garden and the kitchen table, and she thought about her father, who had believed in educating his daughters as well as any son, and she thought about how she had carried that belief into her own life as the inheritance she had not fully understood until she was living it. Caleb had not needed to be persuaded to teach Clara Rose the same things as William. He had assumed it. That assumption said everything. The winter of 1886 into 1887 was long, and the spring late. The ground was still frozen in April, which it sometimes was, and Eleanor was impatient with the delay in planting with a ferocity that she recognized as entirely disproportionate to the actual inconvenience. The garden would be planted, spring would arrive, it always did. But that she understood was really about the profound importance the garden had taken on for her as a symbol of everything she was. The first morning she could get her hands into thawed soil, that April she was out before breakfast, William and Clara Rose and James all trailing after her at various stages of wakefulness, and she plowed her hands into the dark earth of the first bed and felt the cold of it and the life of it, and was satisfied. "It is still early," Caleb said from the garden gate, watching her. "I know," she said. "You might lose some of the early seedlings to a late frost," he said. "I know," she said. He watched her for another moment and then went to find a trowel. By June of 1887, the garden was fully underway, the fence standing into its 13th year, the marigolds newly planted along the perimeter as always, the deer watching from the tree line. Everything was as it had been, and everything was also entirely different, because nothing stands still in a living thing. Caleb sat on the porch on a June evening with James on his lap. The boy was nearly 6 and had recently decided that sitting on one's father's lap was acceptable only in the evenings, and only if no one outside the family was watching the last color drain from the mountains. Eleanor sat beside him with Clara Rose leaning against her shoulder, both of them looking at the same mountains. William was inside, visible through the window, reading by lamplight with the focused absorption of a boy who has discovered that books are a second country you can live in. "Papa," James said. Said Caleb. "Will the fence always be there?" Caleb looked at the fence, standing pale and straight in the dimming evening light. "That fence," he said, "will be there as long as we take care of it, and as long as someone keeps taking care of it." James considered this with the philosophical seriousness he brought to most questions. "I will take care of it," he said, with the total confidence of a small person who has not yet discovered that there are things that exceed one's intention to maintain them. "Yes," Caleb said. "I expect you will." Eleanor looked at her husband across the heads of their children in the evening light, and he looked at her, and the whole long thread of it was there between them. The deer and the beans and the mountain trail and a doorway and a cup of coffee and a storm and a garden and a fence and 12 years of mornings and winters and children and work and love, and ahead of them more of the same, which was not repetition, but abundance. The mountains held their peace above the homestead. The aspens shimmered in the last of the light. Inside the fence, the garden waited in the early summer dark, full and tended and flourishing, kept safe by what had been built for it, and what would always be renewed. She reached across and put her hand over his where it rested on the porch arm, and he turned his hand and held hers, exactly as he had on the first evening in the kitchen of this same cabin, with a storm against the windows and a life beginning. "I want to plant dahlias next year," she said quietly, "along the north end. I have been thinking about it." He was quiet a moment. "I can reinforce the north rail before spring," he said. "Dahlia tubers can push against a frame." "I know," she said. "I was thinking about that. But if we sink an interior edging post, just one, about here," she gestured toward the garden without looking at it, having its geometry perfectly in her head, "it would brace the rail and give the dahlias something to grow toward." He was quiet again, in the evaluating way, and she could feel him modeling it in the extraordinary spatial intelligence he had always possessed. "Yes," he said after a moment, "that would work well." They sat in the evening in Colorado, in the West, that was slowly becoming something other than wild as the century moved toward its end. But it would always be large, always be demanding, always require the kind of people who met it on its own terms. They were those people. They had always been those people. The night came in full, and the stars came out brilliant above the mountains, and inside the cabin, William's lamp still burned where he was reading his second country. Clara Rose had fallen asleep against Eleanor's shoulder and was gently transferred to her father's lap beside her sleeping brother. The horses moved in the corral. The creek beyond the meadow ran its dark, perpetual commentary on everything. The fence stood. It would stand through every season that came after, through the extraordinary summer of 1888, when the garden produced more than they could eat or preserve, and Eleanor gave vegetables away by the wagon load to neighbors and newcomers who were still finding their footing. Through the grief of 1890, when Caleb's sister in Missouri wrote to say that her husband had died and she was struggling, and Caleb wrote back with money and then wrote again to invite her to come west. and she came the following spring with her 2 sons and spent the summer at the homestead while Caleb built her a small house at the edge of their property. A house with a proper garden fence from the very beginning, because he had learned that lesson once and did not intend to let his sister learn it the hard way. Through William's 15th year, when he spent most of his time in Caleb's workshop and began producing work of a quality that was not merely promising, but genuinely accomplished. And Caleb looked at this with the mixture of pride and humility of a teacher who has been equaled. Through Clara Rose's decision, at the age of 14, that she wanted to go to school in Denver, a serious school that had been established for young women, and both her parents' immediate agreement and the arrangements made with care, and the girl's departure on a September morning with her dark eyes very bright, and her composure held by main force, looking more like her mother in that moment than she ever had before. Through James growing long and steady into a boy who moved through the world with his father's quietness and his mother's deep stubbornness, who at the age of 8 could identify every bird that passed through the valley by call alone, and who asked, one March morning, if he could have a section of the garden for his own planting. Eleanor gave him the northwest corner, which received good morning light, and he planted it with a combination of beans, because of his long-standing attachment to them, and sunflowers for no stated reason, and tended it all summer with a care that was so instinctive and complete that Eleanor, watching him from the kitchen window, felt the particular pleasure of a parent who sees a love of their own echoed in a child. The fence stood through all of it. It was repaired and maintained, and once, in the winter of 1891, partially rebuilt along the east side after an unusual ice storm brought down a large aspen limb across that section, which Caleb and William repaired together in a single March day, working side by side in the cold, both of them large men now. William at 16 was already within an inch of his father's height and would pass it before the year was out, working with the easy, silent coordination of people who understand the same things. Eleanor stood at the kitchen window watching them work on that March day, the mountains white behind them, the bare garden waiting for spring, and she held her coffee cup with both hands and thought about time, about the way it moved through a life that was lived paying attention. She thought about the morning in May 12 years before, 18 years before by that count, 1874, she corrected herself, already in 1892, when she had sat in the dirt of her ruined garden and cried for her beans and for Thomas and for the loneliness and the struggle, and how she had stood up and decided that the problem had a solution and gone to find the solution. She had gone to find a fence and had found, incidentally, everything else. She did not believe in fate exactly. She believed in attention, in the willingness to go up the mountain when you needed something, in the willingness to let a door open when it did, in the willingness to ask directly for what you wanted, because life was short and the mountains were large and it was better to be clear. She had been clear. He had been clear. And the clarity between them had built something as sturdy as the fence and as alive as the garden inside it, something that had lasted and grown and fed them and would continue to do so. Caleb and William finished the east side of the fence by mid-afternoon and stood back to assess it, standing together with the same stance, arms slightly crossed, heads slightly tilted, reading the work. Eleanor watched them from the window and loved them both with the totality of a woman who has allowed herself to love completely. Then she went to put more wood on the stove, because it was still March and the cold was real, and she had learned long ago that the best response to the cold was not to resent it, but to burn a good fire and make something warm. Spring came as it always did, and the garden was planted, and the marigolds went in along the perimeter, and the deer watched from the tree line, and the fence stood between the hunger of the world and the growing things inside it, as it had always stood, as it had been built to stand, not just by the man who had sunk the first post in the spring earth of 1874, but by every season of maintenance and every morning of checking and every small repair made before failure could take hold, which was the truest definition of love that Eleanor Marsh Rourke had ever found. Not the grand gesture, but the sustained attention, the willingness to walk the perimeter and check the wire, to sink a new post before the old one failed, to show up every spring with fresh marigold seeds, because the world was full of hungry things and what you grew required protecting. On an evening in June, in the fullness of a Colorado summer that had turned out perfect, Eleanor and Caleb walked the perimeter of the garden together, as they did every evening when the day's work was done and the light was long. He checked the posts with the habitual pressure of his hand. She checked the wire with the habitual pressure of hers. James walked behind them at a 6-year-old remove, carrying a small wooden tool he had made himself in his father's workshop, a miniature version of the post-checking rod, and pressed it against each post as he passed with complete solemnity. The fence held. The mountains above them held their last snow on the peaks in the last of the golden evening light. The garden inside the fence was in full summer voice, everything growing, everything reaching. The marigolds along the perimeter were open and brilliant, orange and yellow and warm, smelling sharp and good, doing their work. Eleanor put her hand on the top rail of the fence and felt the smooth, worn cedar under her palm, sun-warmed and solid, and she looked at her husband, who was looking at her with those gray-green eyes that had changed her life, in a doorway on a May morning when she had gone up a mountain looking for help with something simple, and found something that was neither simple nor containable, but that had turned out to be exactly right. "It is a good fence," she said. He put his hand over hers on the rail, warm and large, and he looked at the garden and at the mountains and at the evening and at everything they had made together, and he said, "It is."